Here's my take. Something puzzling is happening on the world stage. The United States has been infuriating much of the world by being reckless, erratic, and lawless, launching unilateral military actions, roiling the global economy, upending alliances, and treating long-held norms as inconveniences. And yet, China, the world's rising superpower, has not piled on with thunderous denunciations and proclaimed itself the responsible alternative to an unreliable America. Understanding why will help us better grasp Beijing's long game. I spent the last week in China and was struck by how many people there felt differently about this latest American war in the Middle East compared to the last major one. During the Iraq War, Chinese strategists seemed almost gleeful at the spectacle of America mired in the desert. This time, officials, think tank scholars, and business leaders were mostly bewildered by America's chaotic policy, worried about it, and deeply uncertain about what Trump might do next. Some of this is self-interest. China needs the oil and gas that pass through the Strait of Hormuz. More broadly, the country is not a rogue state like Russia. It understands that its growth depends on open sea lanes, functioning markets, and steady rules of the game. Chinese officials repeatedly told me, echoing Xi Jinping, that the United States was taking the world back to the law of the jungle. It's less a moral critique than a strategic anxiety. In a globalized world, when the reigning hegemon becomes utterly unpredictable, it's bad for everyone. Chinese officials claim their country does not want to replace the United States. Its business leaders insisted that America remains the more innovative economy. Even though America has soured on China, those leaders continue to admire Silicon Valley, America's great universities, and the scale and sophistication of the U.S. market. China's strategy is to use this crisis to build its economic strength and global influence. China is doubling down on the frontier technologies that it believes will define the next era of growth. Green energy, robotics, artificial intelligence applied to real industries, advanced manufacturing, and services. Its dominance in some of these sectors is already staggering. It produces 80% of the world's solar panels, about 60% of the wind turbines, and 75% of the batteries. It supplies 70% of all electric vehicles on the planet. China has used the last 3 economic shocks to further its dominance. During the pandemic, Chinese firms surged to supply much of the world with medical equipment. As the artificial intelligence boom swelled, China became central to its physical build-out. The metals, electrical equipment, batteries, cooling systems, and industrial components needed for data centers. Now the Iran war has produced a global scramble for new energy. Here again, China is the indispensable power. It dominates the green technologies, solar, wind, batteries, electric vehicles that countries will need to reduce dependence on imported oil and gas. Beijing turns these industrial strengths into influence. It offers financing, infrastructure, and supply chains. It locks countries into Chinese-made systems. It shows governments that America brings volatility while China brings equipment, credit, and continuity. From 2000 to 2025, Beijing financed projects and ports in 90 countries around the world. Last month, Beijing even offered Taiwan a deal of sorts. Accept peaceful reunification, and the mainland will guarantee your energy security. China's next expansion of influence is crucial. Xi recently made explicit Beijing's ambition to turn the renminbi into a global reserve currency. One former official explained how China would steadily expand its bond market and financial infrastructure so that if investors came to see America as risky, they would have an alternative. Recent weeks have brought an obscure but ominous sign. Institutions like the World Bank and the European Investment Bank have been able to issue debt at rates essentially as low as those offered by U.S. Treasuries. This threatens to end what has been called America's exorbitant privilege of having the world's reserve currency. If that erodes, America will get a very painful shock when its government and its households can no longer borrow so much so cheaply. China is using this moment to burnish its reputation, but mostly to build its power. If the correlation of forces moves steadily in its favor, if America continues to squander its global influence, one day Beijing might decide that, after all, it does want to take on the mantle of the world's leading power. And at that point, it will be too late for Washington to do anything about it. On Friday, Iran announced it was reopening the Strait of Hormuz. But on Saturday, it said the strait was closing again due to breaches of trust by the United States. Just hours ago, President Trump responded with fury on his Truth Social account, calling it a total violation of our ceasefire agreement. He also said that a U.S. delegation will be in Pakistan tomorrow evening for a second round of negotiations, and said that if Iran does not accept a deal, then the United States is going to knock out every single power plant and every single bridge in Iran. Now there are only 3 days left before the U.S.-Iran ceasefire is set to end. And Iran's top negotiator says the U.S. and Iran are still far from a final agreement. Joining me now is Vali Nasr. He is a professor of international affairs and Middle Eastern studies at Johns Hopkins University, and has author of an important book, The Grand Strategy of Iran, which in many ways, I would argue, predicts a lot about what has happened. Why is Iran being so intransigent in the face of these extraordinary threats that Trump has made?
I mean, first of all, Iran thinks that through the 40 days war, they did make some strategic gains that they want to consolidate. And they also think that they can actually get a final deal with President Trump if they stand their ground. But the most important thing here is an issue of trust. I think in Islamabad, the opportunity was for the two sides to build trust that then would allow them to resolve things. But after the talks ended, I think trust has actually collapsed even further between Iran saying it will open the straits, the United States not lifting the blockade, and then President Trump issuing a series of tweets that the Iranians say were false and portrays an image like Iran has already surrendered even before there's a final deal. So I think what we see as Iranian intransigence is also Iran's deep distrust that this is all a ruse, that like what it happened in Geneva, the U.S. is setting them up for something bigger to come.
The Geneva point is important because my understanding is the Iranians thought they were negotiating in good faith in Geneva, and in the middle of it, Trump starts the war. And so there is specifically a lot of lack of trust with the two negotiators, Witkoff and Kushner, correct?
Yes, those two in particular, and especially in Geneva, the last round, because Iran did put forward very new things that it hadn't done before. It went much farther than it had gone before. And what it got instead was bombing. In other words, it's not like the US said, okay, these are great concessions. I want you to concede even more, and I'm going to be tougher until you concede. It just went straight to war. And it had done this once before. When a war happened in June, they were also in the middle of negotiations.
With Witkoff and Kushner.
With Witkoff and Kushner. So the Iranians are extremely suspicious that maybe this whole Islamabad exercise is theater as the United States builds its forces in the region, sort of learns the lessons of the first 40 days, and Trump may go back to war again. So, and also this whole talk about Iran has made concessions is a way of actually creating confusion in Tehran and breaking ranks within Iran.
My own view on that is that Trump is just talking down the stock market. He knows that every time he says things like, we're close to a deal, they've surrendered, the stock market doesn't collapse, which is one of his goals. Is there new leadership in Iran and how to think about that issue of these new people? Are they divided? Are they more hardline?
I believe there is a cohesive leadership. In other words, the top 4 or 5 people are all have known each other, have worked together, are from the same ilk in Iran. They are all Mujtaba Khamenei's people, and he included. So it's not like you have a coalition at the top. You have the same ilk there. They're much more hawkish leaders in Iran. They are not restrained in waging aggressive war. But they've also shown that they are willing to lean into negotiations and diplomacy as well.
What does a more hardline mean?
Means that they are willing to take actions that perhaps the previous supreme leader was not willing to take. For instance, attacking Iran's neighbors in the way they have done. Be willing to escalate with the United States. And as one of the advisors to Mujtaba Khamenei said, it's not an eye for an eye, it's an eye, a head, a hand, a neck. You know, as we sort of, if you provoke, we'll provoke even further. And so this is a very different approach than the previous supreme leader who responded to an American attack on Iran's nuclear facilities with a symbolic sending of missiles into Qatar. But at the same time, I think they've been willing to go further than perhaps the previous supreme leader was willing to go in terms of negotiating with the US. But domestically, you know, the factions in Iran are still the same. The regime still has to manage its base, has to manage public opinion in Iran. It has asked Iranians, in particular its own people, to sacrifice enormously for this war. So when President Trump says, oh, Iran has already given up everything, even before there's a signature, it actually creates a crisis for them about how do they manage perceptions within Iran, which is quite significant.